Well, I asked Ronnie McKee if he would speak this morning, and he acted like he needed hearing aids. So that didn't work. And then I asked Corbin Gosen, and at least he smiled. But that's as far as that went. And so I guess you're stuck with me again this morning. And you can see on the screen that we're back to Romans chapter 13. Last week we spent our time looking at Romans chapter 13, verses 1 through 5. And maybe you can remember that we talked about authority and how we are given a choice in this life, whether we rebel against authority, resist it, or whether we submit to it. And the problem was, what happens when authority is not working for our good? What happens when authority is hostile? What happens when authority is persecuting us? And we left that material last week not knowing really the answer, and we said it's an individual thing. You're going to have to decide where you are in life and how you deal with it. But I decided this morning that we would look at another situation, an example from the Old Testament, maybe one of the best examples from the Old Testament, one that you know well, one that will not take very long to deliver. It's from the book of Daniel. But before I get to that story or those stories, I want to show you this folder. In this folder are 20 outlines on the subject of followership. Now, you need to know that I never keep outlines. I will scratch out some notes, and if it's on a tablet, I tear those off and throw them away. I used to try to keep outlines, but then I would go back and look at them and say, did I really say that? Either I had changed or something had changed, but I just don't keep outlines. But I kept these. So years ago, I wrote a book called The Ultimate Leader. We published a few thousand copies of that book, only to learn that no one would buy it. And then to learn no one would even accept it if you tried to give it away. So we found the best use of that book is to tear out the pages and give it to people for their fireplaces and start the fires in their fireplaces with the pages of this book. But in the midst of all that, I gave a speech one day on the ultimate leader being Jesus. And when I'd finished that speech, someone out of the audience came to me and said, do you think you might ought to talk someday about the ultimate follower? Because not only was Jesus the ultimate leader, he was the ultimate follower. And so I began to think about the idea of followership, even if that's a word. I'm not even sure it's a word. And I began to realize that you and I live our lives every day, exchanging roles. At one moment we're the leader, another moment we're the follower. That's the kind of way it works. And so I spent 20 weeks working our way through this subject of followership, only to realize every single lesson was about this subject of how we respond to authority, and especially adverse authority. So with that, we enter the book of Daniel. Nothing's a surprise about anything that I say. The book begins by having a Babylonian king named Nebuchadnezzar leading a raid, an army against the city of Jerusalem. The word that's used is he besieges the city of Jerusalem. Now, Nebuchadnezzar is a tyrant. He's a king. He's mean. And he goes into Jerusalem, that heart city, that capital city, the city of David, the strong land of Israel. And you know what he does. He destroys the city walls. He goes into the temple of God and steals out the valuable things and then destroys the temple of God. And then he begins to kill people, one after another after another. And from the royal family, from those of nobility, he will choose young men. And he will choose those young men to take back to Babylon to be servants for him. But it's only the ones from the royal family. It's only the ones from nobility. It's only the ones who are extremely intelligent. It's only the ones who are without spot and blemish. And there are apparently many who are chosen. We'll only know about 4 in the entire book. But there are apparently many who are chosen. And they're going to be taken immediately into Babylon. And they're going to be taught the Babylonian language. They're going to be taught Babylonian customs. They're going to be groomed for service. And though the scripture doesn't say it, they're probably going to be made eunuchs so that they will never, ever know the joy of having a family. Now, if you'll pause for a moment and think about that, how would you feel? It's worse than that. They will never go back home. They will never at one time get in this life what they want. And these young men were men of promise. They were royalty. They were nobility. They had dreams. They had hopes. They had great futures. And all that's taken away, and they will never, ever get what they want. How would you feel if somebody had done that to you? And along the way, it killed your family and destroyed your home. How would you feel? And I think most of us would not like one tiny bit of it. So we don't know a lot of the story. That's the way the scripture works. Remember that? It just tells us parts of the story. But immediately the story jumps into the fact that they're being groomed for this 3-year period into these Babylonian ways. And part of the grooming is that they will be fed really well from the king's table, the royal food, the royal wine. And suddenly, for 4 of these young men whose names have been changed to Babylonian names, now Daniel will still be called by his Hebrew name, Daniel, instead of Belshazzar. His 3 friends, you know, that Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego story. But for them, there's a matter of conscience going on. And that's something you kind of ought to underline as we make our way through this lesson. It's a matter of conscience. Because they have grown up being taught the law of Moses. They've grown up being taught a certain way of eating and doing things. And all of a sudden, they're going to be fed foods that don't seem to fit what they have been taught all their lives. And it is a matter of conscience. And they're not going to go beyond that. They're not going to violate their conscience as they honor their God. Now notice, there are others that don't feel the same way. And I'm not condemning the others. The scripture does not condemn the others. It just doesn't mention them. So in a matter of conscience, and by the way, Burke's going to have all this on the screen. You can read it. I'm just going to tell the story for the sake of time. I can tell you're already getting sleepy, so we're going to try to make our way through this. I got 2 grandsons, and they're already slumbering back there. I can see that. Greg McKee's always slumbering, but it's just. And so we begin the story, and God's good to them because God causes this official that's over them to be kind to them, and Daniel will go to him and say, "Sir." Now I inserted the word "sir," but it's that attitude. I want to show you the attitude, "Sir, I just can't eat this food. It violates my conscience." And this official says, "Well, I can't get around this. If I violate what the king has told me, I'll be destroyed. I can't get around it." And so he said, would you quietly put us to a test? Would you give us, the four of us, vegetables and water for a period of 10 days, and then will you examine us compared to the others? I see, we know there are more. There are more that have been stolen away from Jerusalem. Would you compare us to the others? Okay, I'll try to get by with that. 10 days pass. Daniel and his friends look healthier. They look stronger. They look better. And so for the next 3 years, and this doesn't sound all that good to me, but for the next 3 years, they have only vegetables and water. And I hear people complaining all the time saying, I'm getting tired of the same old food. I'm going to tell you, when it's a matter of conscience, you don't get tired. When it's a matter of conscience before God, you don't get tired. But did you notice how Daniel did all that? It was a request. It was with kindness. I'm not sure I would have handled it like that. You see, we have a tendency to murmur and get with our little group behind the door and complain about what's going on, and we have a tendency to look for every way we can to defy and defeat. But Daniel doesn't do it. And years pass. And Nebuchadnezzar dies. And Daniel's getting old. And Nebuchadnezzar has a descendant in Babylon to come to the throne, but he hasn't even learned the lessons of Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar went through 3 hard times, and he finally learned that God was God. But not the one that came after, filled with pride and ugliness. And you know how you reap what you sow? You know how we say in this life, what you give, you're going to get back? The Persians come. And the Persians do to the Babylonians what the Babylonians had done to Israel. And they completely destroy them. And now we have a new Persian king named Darius. He's one of the Persian kings. And Daniel is really old. But God has blessed him with such wisdom. And God has blessed him with such leadership capability. And he's one among many who are leading. But the others, the Persians, look upon this foreigner who's supposed to be a slave, and yet he's getting a little privilege beyond being a slave, and they don't like it, and they're jealous, and there is no end to the cruelty of jealousy. There's no end to the meanness of jealousy. And they persuade this king who's not really thinking it through. Why don't you write a law that says if anybody prays to anyone other than you, O mighty king, they're in big trouble. So much trouble, put them in a den of, and you remember, the den of lions. For they knew exactly what Daniel was going to be like. I mean, he's gone from young to old, living according to the conscience that had been formed from his youth before God. He's not going to stop praying. This, to me, is the saddest story in all the Old Testament. This, to me, is the saddest story in all the Old Testament. Because it says that Daniel goes to his room. And he faces the window that faces, do you remember? Home. Jerusalem. After all these years. He hasn't seen home since he was a boy. He faces the window that faces Jerusalem. He keeps right on praying. It's a matter of conscience. All the while knowing that they would see him, all the while knowing that they would come and get him, all the while knowing that they would take him to the king, and that they did, and they took him to the king and say, see, here's one that wouldn't obey your law, and this law, the Medes and the Persians, it's a done deal. And that king is heart sick. That king can't believe he's been tricked into this, but he has no choice. And the old man is put into that den of hungry lions. And you know what happens? The lions can't get their mouths open. Those hungry, starved lions can't get their mouths open for a moment, for a night. And to the delight of the king, Daniel is okay, and he lifts him out of that den of lions, and he looks at those who have tricked him and he said, now you go in and try it. Let's see how you fare. Let's see if those lions bother you. And tucked in between those two stories about Daniel, you find one story about the other three. And the other three are just like Daniel. Because the other three are now living under Nebuchadnezzar. You see Daniel chapter 1, Nebuchadnezzar, chapter 6, Persians, chapter 3, still Nebuchadnezzar. And Nebuchadnezzar in his pride says, I'm going to build me a great big statue of gold. And when I blow the trumpet or have the trumpet blowing, I want everybody to bow down to my gold statue. Now that is such a meaningless thing. Do you understand that? That's such a meaningless thing. But he's got the power. And power people like to show you they have the power. So I'll blow the trumpets or have the trumpets blow and you all bow down. But here are three young men, just like Daniel, who have a conscience before God. They're not going to bow down and worship an image of gold. They bow down and worship the God they've known since their youth. Only. And all the while they do that, they know the penalty. If you get burned up, you go into a furnace of fire. Now I can think of a lot of ways to die. I prefer the one of dying in my sleep. I certainly don't prefer the one of being thrown into a fire. They know. They know they're going to get caught. And sure enough, they are. And they're brought before the king. And the king's a tyrant. He's a persecuting tyrant. And his ego is out of control. He has what I call the leadership disease, ego out of control. It always destroys, by the way, always. And when you defy ego out of control, you know this, don't you? Ego out of control is hard to live with. It's hard to work for. It's hard to sit next to. And when you kind of push ego out of control, they get so angry because you have defied them. And he gets so angry. You didn't bow down to my image of gold. Don't you know I can put you in that fire? I love how they say it to him. O king. Now, I might have said it differently. I might have said, listen, mister. But they said, O king. We're not really worried about it. We're not really concerned about it. Because even if you put us in that furnace of fire, our God is able. He's able to save us. But you need to know this too. Even if he chooses not. Now, somehow they knew that. They knew that what God did was God's business. They knew that what God did was God's plan. They didn't know which way it was going to go. We know he's able, but we know he might not. It's kind of how you and I have to live. We know he's able, and we make the request, but he might not. But even if he chooses the might not option, O king, we still won't bow down to your image of gold. Well, Nebuchadnezzar can't take it. I'll show you guys. Heat up that furnace 7 times hotter than you normally do it. These guys aren't going to be just toast, and they're not going to be just crispy toast. They're going to be done, disintegrated. In fact, they are so close to being disintegrated that the people who throw them in get disintegrated. And he throws them into that fire. And I don't know where the king's watching from some kind of a distance, but he looks in there and he cannot figure it out. These guys are walking around. They're walking around. And what really gets him is there's a fourth one in there walking around with them, whom everybody seems to think is Jesus. And the point of it is, here are 4 out of many who are so mistreated by ugly authority. And they don't submit necessarily to the ugly authority, but they resist, and not in a rebellious way, in a very unusual way they resist. And all the while because they follow their conscience as they have been trained. Now that in itself is very important, and you're not going to maybe like what I'm about to say. But we all in this audience have a different conscience about different things. Do you know that? We all have a different conscience about different things, because you may look at a scripture, I may look at the same scripture, we may have come from different backgrounds, we may have been trained differently, we have a different view of it. Or we may have a different thought about traditional things, and we have formed a conscience around that. And the scripture seems to say, if you know what you ought to do and you don't do it, it's sin. And the issue there is, when your conscience has been formed, it's out of faith in God that you follow the conscience. And you're going to learn when we get to the next chapter, in chapter 14, that's exactly what Paul's going to say. Some people have a different view here, have a different view there, based on how they've been trained. And God's going to say, you follow your conscience if you want to be faithful to me. Now, it sounds like I'm off the subject, and maybe I am. But when you are standing before authority, and the authority is not good authority, conscience matters. In fact, conscience always matters. But how you have to live according to conscience, that's called faith. You've been taught that way, you live that way. Now, if I grow out of that, I change. Am I making any sense? Everybody following this? But the way you resist is, oh King, we can't. It's a matter of conscience. Mr. Chief Official, I can't eat the royal food. Now, you know when he said that, you know when Daniel said that in chapter 1, he knew he was running the risk of dying right there on the spot. I can't do it. Kill me if you have to. But I propose you give me a chance. It would work better for me if you give me a chance. Let me eat vegetables and water. You see how they operate? I don't know what the point of the lesson is. You're going to have to decide. Conscience is always going to matter. And faith means you follow how you've been taught. And there was a time when Paul would stand before a group and say, I have lived in all good conscience before God, and God respected that. But he said, now my conscience has changed because I learned differently. And when he learned differently, he did differently. But all the while, no matter where you are, you live by that conscience. And you live in respect. That's why in an audience like this, and I got to stop, but when we live in an audience like this, we understand there are people who are different levels of maturity and from different backgrounds of teaching. And if you're in a healthy church, it's always the way it's going to be. If you're in a dying church, everybody looks the same and thinks the same and all that. Growing churches have all these people coming in. But you live by faith in that moment. Kind of dangerous to say that, isn't it? Especially when Bert's going to put it out over the screens and people seeing it different places, and some may not like it. Some hopefully will. We've been born into an unusual kingdom, haven't we? And isn't it a delightful kingdom? Isn't it a delightful kingdom that I can embrace you when you may think differently, and we can together submit to wrongful authorities by matters of conscience in right ways? Isn't it a wonderful kingdom? We got to be born into this kingdom because Jesus was born into our world. And we always try to remember that Jesus was born into our world, and he even died in our world so that you and I could have this new life.